this is Michael Baxter, and this is a walkthrough of my work in creating a dinosaur character. My workflow throughout this module has followed a specific pipeline. The first stage was to do my research both into the type of dinosaur I was going to create and research into what might make my dinosaur unique. The element that was going to separate my dinosaur from the pack was the fact that it was going to be half organic and half mechanical. Next, I took the three dinosaurs I most preferred and drew concepts of them as cyborgs in order to tell which one of them would look best as a cyborg. This, I decided, was going to be the T-Rex, and from here the research continued. In order to avoid straying too far away from the accepted perception of what a T-Rex looks like, I next wrote up quite an informative post and put it on the forum. As I've just mentioned, adhering to the common perception of T-Rex to some extent was an important factor. So when the blueprint guides that were going to be used for the modelling were actually created, it was based on a slightly modified skeletal image of a T-Rex found on the internet. Next, the base mesh had to be built, and this would later be sculpted in ZBrush. This was created by using polymodelling on top of the newly created blueprints. The base mesh was made entirely out of quads, which isn't necessarily an essential aspect, but it would guarantee the distortions within ZBrush often caused by triangles or n-gons in a mesh would be avoided. Sculpting detail into the T-Rex's mesh was a big stage. Firstly, using a reference image from the internet, the muscle strands were moulded into the relevant places on the T-Rex's body. The armour on the T-Rex was modelled simply by masking areas of surrounding geometry, extruding and then smoothing it out. The armour was placed around the dinosaur's body based on the original concepts from my asset breakdown post. The sculpting continued on to defining the claws, the armour type scales on the feet, wrinkles in the skin and a lot of facial sculpting. Reference for all of this was yet again taken from images found on the internet. After the sculpting stage came the retopology. This was done using two different methods. The first method involved drawing polygons onto the surface of the high poly model within Max. The second method involved simply taking a lower subdivision from ZBrush and using small sections that had good edge loops, like the face. The finished retopologized mesh came to 5,304 tries, which I was extremely pleased with because not only was this way under my try allowance, but the dinosaur also still deformed well, mainly due to good edge looping. The next small step I took in T-Rex's development was a little research into the colours that would be used in the texture. The main colours to be used were shades of green, yellow and red, with grey or bluish hues for metallic areas of geometry. The retop was unwrapped next to provide me with some UV coordinates. The unwrap wasn't conventional, as many areas could have used half the space had the T-Rex not been so asymmetrical. And by asymmetrical, of course, I'm referring to the robotic features the dinosaur has, which has made the UV space a little less efficient. However, now that the dinosaur has some UVs, I was then able to project the sculpt detail onto the low poly retopology. The next stage, before actually creating the diffuse map, was to use the cat rig, the automatic rigger within 3ds Max. This involved positioning the cat parent arrow at T-Rex's feet level and pointed in the direction he was facing. Once the bones had been altered to fit the dinosaur's geometry, it was skinned and then animated simply by modifying aspects of the existing animations in the cat rig library. For example, the neck roll while T-Rex walked was increased. An idle and a walk animation were created and saved out of Max using ActorX. This put the animations in .psa files and the skeletal meshes were in .psk files as opposed to FBX format. The diffuse map was the next texture to be created. I didn't go the recommended route of poly painting within ZBrush. Instead, I created the entire thing within Photoshop. To start with, the T-Rex was painted using blockout colours, giving the texture a base to build on. And using constant reference to my colour palette and also images of scaled animals found on the internet, I gradually built up the colours and added finer details to the map. 3 maps minus the normal map were created. These were the diffuse, the specular and the emissive maps. Out of these, changes were suggested by the lecturer to alter the monochrome element in the diffuse and also to lower the brightness of the specular map. In order to remove the dense blacks and whites found in the diffuse, they were simply replaced with more vibrant colours like yellows and reds. The skin in the specular map was darkened quite a bit, but the metal sections remained equally as bright as they had done originally. The next next stage was by far the most technical in this project, and it was UScript. I'm sure most people found this easy, but I certainly had a problem grasping the concept at first. Luckily, sample codes for the pawn character, player character, and game script were made available on Blackboard. In order for the Unreal Engine to recognise these changes to code, Unreal Front End was opened and all of the scripts were recompiled. Even with the code successfully rewritten, T-Rex still wasn't performing as expected within the engine. As soon as the level was loaded and visible, he would spawn below ground and die immediately, but because there was an insufficient physics asset, instead of just falling to the floor, he would flop about and distort hideously. In order to resolve these issues, firstly the physics asset was changed. The asset was fully reset with fewer bones, and these bones had a swing and twist constraint added to them. Next, the low spawning issue was easily solved simply by increasing the pawn's Z value within the properties window. Now that these changes have been made, the dinosaur now spawns correctly and chases after your character, and this is because of its deathmatch AI that's been assigned to it. Also, when the ragdoll effect takes place, the dinosaur now dies a lot more realistically, as opposed to flopping about. With footage of a successful run-through captured, I then added the video onto websites such as DeviantArt, Polycount and Game Artisans so that industry professionals could give me some critique and feedback on it. A recurring suggestion for improvement was to change the level at which T-Rex was leaning, and to also increase the size of its feet. Unfortunately, neither of these suggestions could be acted upon at this stage. When comparing my work to that of one of my peers, Ben McEwen, there were a lot of similarities. These similarities came mainly from the research stage, although Ben did arrive at his dinosaur choice a lot sooner than I arrived at mine. Ben's work seemed quite concise and thorough throughout the creation of the base mesh, yet the sculpting stage in comparison was rushed and lacked explanation and reasoning of techniques. My cat rigging technique, in comparison to Ben's, was rushed, or at least the explanation of it was. He walks the reader through the skinning process and explains how he overcame a couple of the issues he had in this process. All in all, I prefer my workflow and outcome more than Ben's. However, we have both ended up achieving the original aim, which was to have a dinosaur working within a game's engine.